Well, we have been waiting a long time for this one to finally be made official, but one of the worst kept secrets in the Championship is now out there. Frank Lampard has been announced as the new head coach of Coventry City after Mark Robins was sacked near the start of November in a very controversial decision amongst Coventry City supporters. We're going to do what we usually do in these episodes, talk about the old man, talk about the new man, and what's going to happen moving forward for Coventry City. And as always, we'll encourage you to get your views in the comments as well. Let us know what you think of the managerial change, because I know this one is probably quite an emotive one for Coventry fans. If we go back and talk about Mark Robins, the statement came at the start of this month, ironically after 2 wins in 3, that Mark Robins had been sacked by Coventry City. Now, it's not so much the sacking, albeit I think it's a stupid decision, but that will be proven later down the line. The way it was dealt with from start to finish, I've mentioned it a few times in different prediction shows as we've gone through the match weeks, have really irked me a little bit. It just lacked a little class from Coventry, which is something that over the last few years we've always associated with the club. As Luton fans, we obviously had that day at Wembley about 18 months ago now, and Coventry fans were exceptional. So there's always been that bit of a soft spot for it. However, Mark Robins, after taking charge at the club, I don't think we need to reflect on whether he was a success like we do in most of these situations. He took the club from League Two through not playing at their own stadium and sharing various grounds throughout the years, all the way up to the Championship, 2 promotions including League One champions, an EFL trophy which he took part at the end of, almost getting to the FA Cup final last year, penalty kicks away from the Premier League the year before against my club. Mark Robins has done not just a good job, he's done a job, I sort of alluded to it a couple of weeks ago, it's the equivalent of a Klopp or a Guardiola for Coventry City, because he's done what was unthinkable at the time. He's taken a club from on its knees and at the bottom end of the Football League without a home to a club that is knocking on the door at the Premier League and maybe is considered to be underachieving early in the season in mid-table in the Championship, which is where he was sacked from. And the fact that he was sacked for being in that position, for the club potentially underachieving, is probably the greatest testament to the job he's done, because that would have been considered beyond success and beyond a dream when he took over. He's got Coventry back to where they should be. He's got them fighting for big things, and he's done an exceptional job while generally playing pretty entertaining football and losing star players every summer. He's been a remarkable success at the club. He's dealt with everything with such class, and he's just been a fantastic manager. And we mentioned it before, every other Championship job that will come up now, and you've seen it already with the whole job this week, immediately the bookies' favourite will be Mark Robins. And that tells you how well thought of he is, that he will be the first name linked with every Championship job. If we go back and look at what's happened since, though, from a Coventry point of view, for me it's been a few worrying trends in the last 3 or 4 weeks, because not only was the statement a little bit difficult to take for some, but if we go ahead to Doug King's silence and then the fan forum and his several national media outlet interviews afterwards, it leaves a few question marks, because I've picked out 2 of the things that stood out to me, which were him talking about similar positions in the past. So he said, we made this change now because Coventry City have done it from this position before. We need to give ourselves the best possible platform. Now, the reason they did that before is because they had Mark Robins in charge when they did it. They had a shocking start, a worse start in the year that they got to the playoff final. They've always been slow starters, yet they still managed to find their way there. And last year, if it wasn't for that FA Cup semi-final, they were probably on course to make the playoffs, but then had to sort of split their loyalties, and it almost paid off because they were a whisker away from beating the eventual FA Cup winners. But the second thing, and the one that really got me from the statement, was the one about Birmingham City, where he talked, Doug King, about the fact that if we didn't act now, we could have ended up being Birmingham. We know from last year sides aren't too good to go down. But the reason Birmingham went down last year is because they sacked an incredibly popular manager who was doing a solid job, and then they fell into freefall by getting in a big name for commercial revenue and commercial value, but without perhaps the coaching pedigree and substance to back it up. And the events of the 3 weeks since have perhaps made that a bit more worrying, because the new man who comes in to replace Mark Robins, who over a 7-year period, by the way, 40% win rate, won over 150 games, and of course 2 promotions, EFL trophy, FA Cup semi-final and a playoff final in a Championship. There's no doubt in the job he's done, but replacing him is Frank Lampard. We'll get the statement up. who has got a bit of a mixed record, I would say, as a manager so far. I wouldn't say it's as bad as some people have made out. I had this same debate with the Wayne Rooney Plymouth situation this summer. But when you're looking at replacing a stalwart like Mark Robins, it does become quite difficult. And we've seen it before at other clubs. Replacing a long-term manager who's done such great things for so long can be a difficult situation. However, Coventry City are delighted to announce the appointment of Frank Lampard as the club's head coach. The 46-year-old signs a 2.5-year contract and takes charge of his first game against Cardiff City on Saturday. We'll get to that in a minute. He's brought in Joe Edwards with him, who of course had a brief unsuccessful managerial stint at Millwall last year, who have shot up the table under Neil Harris since he left, and Chris Jones, who he's worked with before. No sign of Jody Morris yet, though, despite him being open to the idea seemingly in the media the last week or so, and the man who was on his right-hand side for probably the most successful times in his career so far as a manager. So Frank Lampard, obviously we're talking a bit about the history, took charge of Derby in 2018, which is probably the most comparative role to this, a championship job, a team looking to make the playoffs. We all heard Doug King's vision, the 3-5 playoff team, hoping they can make it on one of those occasions. But let's put a little bit of perspective here, because it's the first thing that really concerns me. What happened with Derby after that spell? They invested a lot of money, a lot of wages, a lot of infrastructure in trying to get to the Premier League. They gambled a bit in Wayne Rooney's spell. And while I think he achieved par to reach the playoffs, when you consider there were some very good teams at the top end of the championship, but I think playoffs was probably about par for the squad he had. Players that have now gone on to become household Premier League names, but we didn't know at the time. The likes of Mason Mount, Harry Wilson, obviously Fikayo Tomori, who's moved over to Milan as well. But some really good names in there. But he got them into the playoffs and was a whisker away from the Premier League himself. So he did a solid job there. My worry is, given the rhetoric coming out from Doug King, is he going to put Coventry City in jeopardy? Is there going to be this risk of, we're going to gamble it because I want to prove I was right to sack Mark Robins and bring in Frank Lampard? And does it lead to a problem later down the line? It's my biggest bugbear in the background at the minute that I just worry a little. So I hope I'm going to be wrong on that front and they don't just go mad. That maybe they're bringing a few loan players and he works with the squad they've got, which is good, by the way. I'm hoping we don't see that because Coventry have had enough problems on that side of things in recent years. He then obviously went on to Chelsea and was largely lauded for the job he did in that first season with a lot of those young players under transfer embargo. They couldn't bring people in, but actually the problems came once he could, because they spent big the following summer, and dealing with those bigger characters was something that he did struggle with a bit more, as well as dealing with a bigger squad. At Everton, they survived right at the end, but it was far from pretty. A 27% win rate, and since then has survived more comfortably under Sean Dyche. So again, you're looking at what's happened since he's left the club. They've improved. Chelsea, bit of a difficult one. Obviously, the second interim spell was a disaster. It's since gone right under Pochettino and Maresca, but I don't think you can judge that one much. What you can judge him on, though, is Derby and Chelsea the first time, and Everton, to be fair, which is a real mixed bag in terms of success. You would expect that, like some of the others we've seen in the Championship, Wayne Rooney being a current one, of course, you may command respect for his stature and his career on the pitch, and of course he has got experience of the Championship, which is something very important. However, I do worry about him not having Jody Morris alongside. He was there at Derby and in that first Chelsea stint, which were by far his two most successful. And given what we've seen with Joe Edwards as a manager at Millwall, that doesn't fill you with the most confidence, and from what we saw at Everton as well. However, I think the board, in terms of timing, have given him the best possible chance, because if you look at when he's come in now, and obviously there's been an extended interim spell, which, not coincidentally, have gone through the games against Sunderland and Sheffield United and Burnley, who are all in the top four. He now comes in when in the next 6 games they face managerless Cardiff at home, who are 21st. They face Hull, who are 22nd, and now managerless too. And then bottom side Pompey and very much struggling Plymouth Argyle under Wayne Rooney. Obviously at home to Millwall to start of the new year, and Cardiff away again. In their first 8 games, bar Millwall and West Brom away, they're all games where you would be targeting points as a Coventry team if you are looking to make the playoffs, which it seems the owner wants to do. Because let's look at the Doug King point of view here. Coventry were 7 points off the playoffs in a similar to position to what they've been in previous years after a slow start. And they've sacked Mark Robins after they'd won 2 of their previous 3 games. They battered Borough away, who went on and battered everyone else for the rest of the month until midweek. And they absolutely battered Luton, were unfortunate to go 2 down and came back and did well. So in terms of the Mark Robins situation, it makes it hard to gauge what the expectations are, because if Frank Lampard doesn't make the playoffs, he surely has to be considered a failure now. And that's not because I think Coventry should be in the top 6 or that I think Coventry have one of the best 6 squads in the division. I think they're one of those teams in and around that mix, but there are a lot of good sides in the Championship, and it can just come down to who's injured, who's suspended, who has their best team available more of the year. We've seen that certainly defensively with Luton, my club, in the early stages of this season. But given the fact that Mark Robins was mid-table, was starting to push on and was only 7 points off the playoffs, I go back to what we said. When John Eustace was sacked from Birmingham last year, when Tony Mowbray was sacked from Sunderland 3 points off the playoffs, how can you almost succeed as the new man? Because unless you go and win every game and break into that top 6, you're not going to be able to justify the change. And that has often been the biggest problem. It's very rare we've seen in recent seasons that sides near the top have sacked their manager and gone on a run and got themselves up there. It's often been sides that have come from way back, or it's been the sides that have stayed consistent. Let me give you the best example of that, which is if you go back to last season's championship table, the top 9 teams all kept the same manager for the entirety of the season. Now, since then, Hull City sat Rossini at the end of it. They're now in the relegation zone. But otherwise, that stability has proven itself to lead to consistency and improvement on the pitch. Further down the division, almost every other side changed manager, including all of the sides that got relegated. Birmingham sacked their manager in the playoffs and finished 22nd. So it does ask the question, is it the right decision? I don't think Frank Lampard's as bad a manager as some have made out. The same as the Wayne Rooney, the Steven Gerrard things and whatever before. There's always going to be that ridicule and that playing on the failure. That seems to be stuck to all of England's golden generation when it comes to management. And fair play to Frank Lampard for dropping back into the Championship and saying, I'm going to have a go at it and try and prove myself. I do feel it's a horrible job to take on in terms of following Mark Robins. Coventry has been a club that's been steady and stable for the last few years, but that's because of the Mark Robins factor. Whether or not they'll be able to maintain that without him, I don't know. I should also mention, I've discussed it a couple of times, I really didn't like what Doug King did in the media afterwards regarding the situation with AD Viviash in the summer and all of that. The fact that we don't know the other side of events. We don't know if that's true, what Mark Robins would say in response. It doesn't really matter. If you're a manager and you're going into a boardroom with a chairman and you're having these discussions, say during a summer, transfer window discussions, all of those things as well, the last thing you expect is that when actually you've been sacked and maybe a few people have a bit of backlash against it, the Coventry fans incredibly supportive of Mark Robins, as you would expect. For him to then come out and sort of air dirty laundry that he thinks might support him or back him up or try and make him look a bit better, I really didn't like that. Even if it is true, that conversation's been had in confidence with your employed manager at the time about the running of the club. That shouldn't leave the boardroom. If a manager came out and said that sort of thing afterwards, the chairperson would probably want to have a word. So I'd be a little bit careful on that front. It just disappointed me the way it's been handled. But for Frank Lampard, we normally ask the question, will he see out a 2.5-year contract with a new manager? That Coventry suggests maybe there's a chance, but as I mentioned a few minutes ago, based on what Mark Robins has been sacked for and where they were, I don't see how he can get into the playoffs this year. And if he doesn't, I don't see how he's considered a success. So whether it's the end of this season or early next year, unfortunately, I do think the average championship manager lifespan of 10, 11 months is going to become the norm here as well. And that does worry me. I hope I'm wrong. I hope Frank Lampard succeeds. He comes across well. He has got a history for developing younger players. So hopefully he'll be able to do that at Coventry. And they're a club whose supporters I'd like to see have a good time as well. So fingers crossed it goes better than I expect. But I've got to be honest, I have a number of reservations here. Both in the way that the Mark Robins situation was handled, but also in terms of what's coming moving forward and those who have come in alongside Frank Lampard, particularly those who haven't in Jody Morris's case. It doesn't really matter what I think though, does it? Where do you think Coventry will finish this season? Do you agree with me that now the playoffs are beyond reach? Do you think that Frank Lampard gives you a better chance and that I'm completely wrong and the Mark Robins situation maybe had just run on for a little bit too long? Give us your thoughts in the comments. Coventry fans, are you confident How long do you think Frank Lampard gets? And do you think Coventry City will have a good season? Let us know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this one, a little look at the changing managerial situation there, please do put a thumbs up on the video. Subscribe to stay up to date with everything. We had our championship predictions for this weekend earlier today. You can find them in the eye above and see what I went for Frank Lampard's debut game in charge. There's also a few more to come now with both Cardiff and Hull City managerless, and a few more under pressure, including a bit closer to home for me. So keep sticking around. It's going to be a busy month or so. And I'll see you again next week here as we look ahead to next weekend in the EFL Championship.